Hello everyone, Bendy Bono here with the first half of question 19 of Prima Part of Summa Theologica. This question's been a bit delayed getting this video out, just a very busy week in my life with work and stuff, so got this out a few days later than I intended, but we are rolling right along. Like I said, question 19, I'm doing the first half because it's a 12 article question, so kind of a long one, so we'll break that up. But we are now done with the section on God's knowledge. We're right into God's will, which is a fascinating topic, and I think you'll be, especially if this is kind of one of those hot button issues in modern Christianity and really in post-Reformation Christianity, especially within Protestant circles and everything. So if you're interested in that topic, Calvinism, Arminianism, I think you'll find a lot of interest here in what St. Thomas has to say. The one caution I would make there is to, and I say this out of my own experience with reading the Summa through a post-Reformation lens and then finding some confusion in these sections, is to realize that, of course, Aquinas is writing several centuries before Calvin, Luther, all those guys. So, again, as we've noted before, the questions he asks might not be the same ones we would ask. And there are times where, because of the language and terminology that those of us who've been exposed to the Calvinist-Arminian debate are familiar with, we might be confused by when Aquinas uses some of those same terms in a different way. It is important to note that the Calvinist-Arminian debate, for as all-encompassing as it tends to be in some circles, and it's a very fascinating discussion, is actually a wholly Protestant concept, and even more narrow than that, it's a concept within different branches of the disciples of Calvin. In other words, Jacob Arminius, who is the father of Arminianism, was actually a disciple of Calvin. And then those who kind of developed Calvin's ideas into what you think of when you think of like 5-point Calvinism and tulip and all that stuff. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry. You don't need to understand Calvinism to understand the section. But, so that debate takes place within not only Protestantism, but within a smaller section of Protestantism. And so I think it's important to realize that when it comes to theological positions on the will of God, on things like predestination, all of which Aquinas is going to touch on here, that those views are not limited to a spectrum where you have Calvinism on one end and Arminianism on the other. And what you'll find in views, whether they're in Protestantism or in Eastern Orthodoxy or in Catholicism, when you find Christian views that don't conform to that spectrum, you'll see they kind of pick and choose, or seem to be picking and choosing from there. So at times, someone like Aquinas will sound a bit more like a Calvinist. At times, will sound a bit more like an Arminian. And to avoid that being confusing for those who are familiar with the debate, you just have to understand that spectrum is really meaningless as far as Aquinas is concerned, and really as far as Catholic theology is concerned. It doesn't conform to landing neatly anywhere on that spectrum. Now, of course, the one caveat to that is that aspects of Calvin's understanding of the will of God and of predestination are coming out of Augustine. And so it is, from that perspective, Aquinas is in conversation with the Augustinian view of predestination and of God's will, which at times has heavy overlap with what Calvin says. Calvin, of course, being very influenced by Augustine in his development of predestination and God's will. So at times that you can put Calvin and Aquinas into conversation with one another by way of Augustine. But be that as it may, important to realize for those of us who are in some degree or another familiar with that debate that we're really not talking about that here, that there will be points of overlap, but Aquinas' view of God's will is much different and much broader, and that's not to say anything positive, negative, or different about Calvinists or Arminian views if you happen to be one or the other. It's simply to help us to have a greater understanding of what Aquinas is saying, rather than trying to fit him into one box or other in a debate that he, is hundreds of years after his time. So, without further ado, let's dive into question 19. The will of God. We're covering articles 1 through 6. Whether there is will in God. Probably, given that we've got 11 more articles to talk about there. Whether God wills things apart from himself, I hope so. Whether whatever God wills, he wills necessarily. Whether the will of God is the cause of things, right there is one that will kind of trip us up if you're looking at this exclusively from a Calvinist lens, because what Aquinas actually means there is not, does God cause all things to happen in the sense of God is controlling every action, but is the will of God the cause of the existence of things, okay? So that's kind of one of those traps you have to look out for those of us familiar with the Calvinist-Arminian debate. Whether any cause can be assigned to the divine will, and whether the will of God is always fulfilled. All right, so is there a will of God? Well, let's find out. The object of the will is the end. God has no end, therefore there is no will in God. Will is a kind of appetite. We will things out of a sense of desire. God has no appetite. He's not hungry. No, that's not what it means. It means, reason God doesn't have an appetite is because appetite implies some deficiency in us. We have a desire to fulfill something that we don't have. Aristotle says that the will moves and is moved. God is immutable, therefore it does not have a will. But watch out, Romans 12:2 says God has a will. All right? The intellect of God implies the will of God, since one follows the other logically. Aquinas doesn't really explain how that much, but we'll take his word for it. Just as God's intellect is his existence, so is his will. So again, conforming to the divine simplicity, as we've seen before. God has no end outside himself, but he himself is the end of all things made by him or willed by him. Okay? Will is appetitive for us, since by our will we seek the good we don't possess. Since God's goodness is his essence and his will is essence, because his will is his existence and his existence is his essence, you see how all these things in God, because of his divine simplicity, ultimately become interrelated. His will seeks good, his own essence, without being appetitive. Since God's will is his essence, it is not moved by anything but itself, the essence of God. So there you have it. But does God will things apart from himself? Well, obviously he does, or we wouldn't be having this conversation on this video. So, God's will is his existence. God's existence is not other than himself. Therefore, he does not will things other than himself. Aristotle says the willed moves the willer. Therefore, if God wills something apart from himself, he is moved by something apart from himself. This is impossible. So this is kind of an expansion then. We're going back to this objection here from Article 1, expanding on it a little bit. God's own goodness suffices him. Therefore, he has no reason to will anything beyond himself. Acts of will are multiplied according to the number of things they will. Since God's will is his existence would be multiplied by willing other things. And this, of course, is impossible because God is one. But 1 Thessalonians 4:3 speaks of God willing things apart from himself. And here we are to further prove that. It is part of the nature of the will to want to spread the good it possesses as far as possible. That's really an important point here, right? So, part of God's goodness is to want to spread his goodness. Otherwise, if he didn't want to do that, he wouldn't be fully good. This is true of natural things, but even more so true of God, who is total perfection. Therefore, he wills other things in order that they may partake of his goodness. So and that's really a cool idea when you think about it. to me anyway, not to get off on a tangent here, but sometimes what can, I think, turn people off to certain forms of Calvinism, and I'm not speaking blanketly across all people who would endorse Calvinist beliefs, but that, they really stress the will of God. And at times it results in a very angry sounding God. But no, the will of God is ultimately there because he is willing to spread his goodness to us. So right there, it results in a very loving and personal picture of God that sometimes gets lost in conversations about God's will. Important to keep in mind. God's will is his existence, but the two have different aspects. When we speak of God's existence, nothing but him is implied. When we speak of God's will, it follows that other things are implied. Okay? The end of God's will is always his own goodness. He wills other things by willing his own goodness. Therefore, nothing moves him apart from his own goodness. So, God wills us, but he wills us for the end of his own goodness, right? Because his own goodness wants to spread his goodness to others. And then similar thing here to objection 3, God wills other things not for their end, but for the end of his own goodness. And then finally, God's will is one and simple in that it wills, typo there, first one of the day, his own goodness, and in so willing wills many things. So God's will is one. He's willing his own goodness, but within that one act of will, there are many subsequent parts. Similar to the analogy Aquinas has used about, a house. That when you think about a house, you're thinking of one thing, but there's many things within that one thing. Does God will whatever he wills necessarily? That's Article 3. Well, let's take a look. Whatever God wills, he wills from eternity, and everything from eternity is necessary. God wills everything through willing his own goodness. His goodness is necessary. Therefore, all things he wills are necessary. Whatever is part of God's nature is necessary. God's will is necessary because it is part of God's nature. Everything is contingent, is imperfect. If God's will is not necessary, it is contingent and therefore imperfect. This cannot be, since God is wholly perfect. Aristotle says that if one is indifferent to one or the other of two things, no action will result until one is inclined. Second type of the day. One is inclined to one or the other. If God is indifferent to the outcome of what he wills, in other words, if it's not actually necessary, then something outside of him must cause him to act, which is impossible. Kind of a complex objection there, but if you kind of think through it, it makes sense. It's more linguistically confusing than anything else, and that could be a defect on my part with how I wrote it. Whatever God knows, he knows necessarily. God knows what he wills. But Paul tells us that God works all things according to his will, and to work according to his will, and to work according to the will is not to will necessarily. Right? Things can be necessary absolutely or by supposition. So one of, like he does so often, Aquinas is now parsing a definition. What do we really mean when we talk of something being necessary? A thing is necessary absolutely when it must be by definition. It is necessary absolutely that man be an animal. Why? Because to be a man is to be an animal. That's just part of the definition. Things are necessary by supposition when they are not absolutely necessary, but might be so. It is not absolutely necessary that Socrates sits, but it might be so. Socrates can be Socrates without sitting. However, there might be times when he needs to sit, and that is necessary by supposition. God wills something... I'm not doing well with the typos on this one, everyone. Sorry about that. Absolutely, but not all things. Oh, no, that wasn't a typo. I meant some things, plural. So God wills some things. Maybe I should put a space in there just to make it clear. Absolutely, necessarily. God wills some things absolutely necessary, but not all things. God wills his own goodness necessarily. God wills other things insofar as they are ordered to this end, the end of his goodness. When we will things as part of willing to an end, we do not will them absolutely, unless not willing them would result in the end not being fulfilled. Since God's goodness is perfect, its absolute necessity does not depend upon other things. Therefore, other things that God wills in the one single act of willing his goodness are willed suppositionally, but not absolutely. Whatever God wills from eternity is only necessary by supposition. God wills his own goodness necessarily, but not all things willed on account of his goodness are necessary. Reply to objection 3. It is not part of or against God's nature to will things he does not will necessarily. 4. The fact that God doesn't will all things necessarily is not a result of a defect on the part of his will, but on the part of the things willed. Reply to 5. The divine will moves itself since it is necessary. And finally, God knows necessarily whatever he wills, but does not will necessarily whatever he wills. Kind of confusing stuff there. It'll twist your brain a little bit, but it is untangleable if you kind of work on it. Can't say the same for this next one. This one confused me a great deal, even though the basic, so Article 4, whether the will of God is the cause of things. And the answer is yes. Things exist because God wills that they exist. So that's the basic concept. And then I found myself very lost along the way with how Aquinas got there. So fair warning. Dionysius says that God's goodness goes upon everything. This eliminates any sense of election, which is a requirement for will. God acts, and that's not election in the sense that a Calvinist would intend it. That's election simply in, when you will something, you choose to will it. You elect to will it. God acts, his essence. God acts, his and essence. I don't know what I was intending to. Oh, God acts. I don't know what I was meaning to write there, everyone. I'm sorry. Like I said, a busy week. And I was trying to work on other projects while writing some of these so that I could get this first part done. So let's just roll it. Therefore, his nature, not will, is the cause of things. We'll just say God's nature, not... I'm just going to delete that part because I don't know what I was meaning to write. Sorry, everyone. That's what happens sometimes. You got to have weeks like that. But this article is confusing enough without me doing that. Augustine says that because God is good, we exist. Therefore, it is not his will that causes us to exist, but his goodness. There can only be one cause of a thing. It was previously said in Part 1, Question 14, Article 8, that God's knowledge is the cause of a created thing. Therefore, his will is not. Wisdom 11:26, though, says we would not exist if God didn't will it. All right. Argument. God acts by will as shown in 3 ways. First, because the intellectual and voluntary agent precedes the agent who acts by nature, God is the first agent, therefore he acts by will and intellect. Second, God being fully perfect cannot act out of a necessity in his nature, because there is no necessity, therefore his actions proceed from his will and intellect. They are voluntary. And then third, since all things pre-exist in God's intellect, and his intellect is his essence, it logically follows that his will is what causes things to come into being from his intellect. Again, I don't fully follow the logic there, but essentially what he's getting at is that no, it's not God's nature that causes things, it's his will, because his nature doesn't have any deficiency that would necessitate other things existing, but it's a voluntary choice on his part. All right. Dionysius did not intend to exclude election absolutely, but only conditionally. Apply to 2. God's essence is his intellect and will. Therefore, in acting as his essence, he acts according to his will. Objection 3. God is the object of the will, or good is the object of the will. What Augustine says is true in the sense that God's goodness is why he wills other things. It's kind of going back to the previous article. And then finally, apply to objection 4. In God, his will and knowledge are one. So we're not contradicting when we said that God's knowledge is the cause of things. All right, rolling right along. Article 5. Whether any cause can be assigned to the divine will. Number 1, God does not act irrationally. Therefore, his reason for acting is the cause of his will. 2, if there is no cause to God's will, then God's will is the ultimate cause of all things, and any science would then become pointless, because pursuing any science would just point right back to his will. If God's will has no cause, then all things depend exclusively on his will, which cannot be. Okay? Nothing is greater. I don't quite understand why that can't be, but we're just rolling with it. Nothing is greater than the will of God. Therefore, there is no cause to it. That is the argument from authority. All right, getting into the argument. The means and the end of God's willing are not separate for him as they are in us. Therefore, in one act of will, he wills the mean and the end of what he wills, and this necessitates there being no cause for his will. Again, don't entirely understand why, but I can buy the big picture idea of God's will being uncaused, and that's really the main point here. Remember, key terms, big ideas. Objections answered. Number 1, God's will is reasonable, not because there is a cause to his willing, but because he wills logical relations between things. Okay. Reply to 2, God wills secondary causes to things. This is an important concept, that yes, God's will is the ultimate cause, but he also wills secondary causes to things, which make the pursuit of science worthy, even though the ultimate cause of everything is his will. So science is still worthy because it can discover those secondary causes. So don't worry, science frowns. Well, we got you covered. All right. Then even in willing secondary causes, God wills that things be dependent on causes other than his will, though in a conditional sense. Okay? And we'll get into that a bit more in Article 6, whether the will of God is always fulfilled. And this does have a little bit of overlap to the Augustinian Calvinist understanding of predestination, will, all that. And you'll see that right off the bat here in Objection 1, which says, quotes that famous 1 Timothy verse, 1 Timothy 2:4 says that God wills all men to be saved. This doesn't happen. Therefore, God's will is not always fulfilled. That's a very problematic verse in any discussion of God's will. God wills all good, but not all good exists. Therefore, the will of God is not always fulfilled. God wills secondary causes, but the effect of a first cause might be hindered by a secondary cause. If you're think of a machine and you have one cog turn another cog, well, the goal of the end of that first cog is going to be hindered if the second cog is broken and doesn't want to turn, right? So, therefore, God's will is not always fulfilled on account of defects in the secondary causes. Argument from authority. Well, Psalm 113:11 says, God hath done all things whatsoever he would. In other words, whatever God wills is fulfilled. Okay? What about the argument? Things can fall short of a particular form or cause, but not of a universal form or cause. And the example Aquinas gives us is that a being may fall short of being a man, which is its particular form or cause, but it cannot fall short of being a being, because that's just by definition, that's what it is. That's the universal form or cause. God's will is the universal cause of all things, and therefore it cannot fail. Anything that falls short of his will in one way will fulfill it in another. That's kind of that God works all things according to his will. Works all things to good, which is what we saw that reference in one of the previous articles. All right. Objections answered. So this verse, this 1 Timothy verse, can be understood in 3 ways. Very complicated verse, but this is a very influential answer because Aquinas he takes from Damascene and Augustine here, but you'll see different people give different answers to this. Really, the typical Christian answers to this verse, when it comes to wanting to say, if you want to take the position that God's will is always fulfilled, you really have to give one of these 3. This is pretty exhaustive. Now, there might be variations on them, but whenever somebody, today, in any of those debates, makes that answer, they're usually going to cite some form, some variation of one of these 3. So Augustine understands it as meaning that God wills to save all whom he saves. It's kind of a problematic answer because you're having to do a little bit of mental gymnastics with the text to get it to say that. Same thing with number 2. God wills to save from every class of individuals, but not every individual of each class. So every group of people. God wills all men, meaning men in a group sense, to be saved, but not every individual within that group. Again, tough to take that position because you're doing some serious mental gymnastics with the text. All right, then finally, Damascene interprets this verse as referring to God's antecedent will, not his consequent will. What's the difference? Well, God's antecedent will is what God wills, all things being equal. Okay, everything else being equal, God wills everyone to be saved. But God's consequent will has to take other things into account, such as his justice and human sin, and a lack of salvation, a lack of pursuit of salvation, whatever would come into somebody being damned. And I know that that's, in some theological circles, even the concept of being damned is a controversial concept today. But for the sake of Aquinas, we're going to roll with it because we're trying to understand him, not necessarily prop up our own positions. And so because of that, in the Aquinas view of salvation, his soteriology, damnation is possible on account of human sin and God's justice. So because of that, he's going to endorse the third view that says that God does will all to be saved antecedently, but on account of his justice and human sin, he wills some to be damned. And that's part of his consequential will. Okay, so very interesting distinction there, and an important one to grasp. All right, reply to objection 2. God wills himself, in whom all good virtually exists. So, and then finally, objection 3. A first cause can only be permanently hindered by a deficient secondary cause when the first cause is not the universal cause. God's will is the universal cause, and as such, he will work all things works all things to good, according to his will, is really what that's getting at. So, secondary causes might seem to derail things, but in an ultimate sense, they don't. In the ultimate sense, God's will be fulfilled and does prevail, which ought to be good news for those of us who seem to be good at screwing up in one way or another, right? That's, I think, a very comforting thought. Anyway, there you go. 6 articles. Good to be back at it here after several days of not being able to have the time to get around to doing any Aquinas, but great stuff. So there you have it. I'll be back hopefully sooner rather than later with articles 7 through 12, and we'll keep rolling. But for now, I'm Ben DiBono, and I'll see you later.